This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to DBrief, the podcast where we explain policy to industry and industry to policymakers. I'm Jeff Wilson, and for once, we've flipped our roles around today, and I'm holding the questions because today I'm being joined, and mostly to interview the person who usually sits in the question-holding chair, Louise McGrath, our Head of Industry Development and Policy. Louise, welcome to your own podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. I might say it's about time, but I guess it's up to me.
Thanks. Well, Louise, we have a lot to cover today, and it will be a podcast in two acts. Over the last about the last 2 weeks, we've had a whole heap of new things come out, both nationally and internationally on AI, a new AI policy framework for Australia and developments from overseas in both China and the Vatican. As well as some big developments in related things in the global economy, particularly around cybersecurity emanating from AI, and something that's occupied headlines quite a bit that we've been involved with, which is US tariffs and issues around forced labour and modern slavery in Australia. That's a lot for us to cover, but I'll jump straight into it with the AI part, and we'll start here. So on the 15th of July, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, gave a speech at the University of Sydney about AI and AI regulation in Australia. Now, it marked a big change from where government policy had been in Australia, say, late last year, where more enabling and permissive language around uptake was emphasised. But recently, the Prime Minister said that the government wants to move away from a kind of what he called an issue-by-issue approach to regulating AI to have a more nationally consistent framework, with one key announcement being the establishment of a new Office of AI inside the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Louise, what was in that announcement, and how's that really going to impact those of us in industry who are grappling with the AI uptake challenge today?
Well, thanks, Jeff. So it is quite a significant shift in the machinery of government. Previously, and we were part of the advocacy on this, there was talk initially when Ed Husic was Minister for Industry of having an Act of AI, so that governed all of government, that's spread across all regulators. So every time you did a regulation or you read a regulation, you had to read this Act of AI. Fortunately, everyone saw sense and said, well, actually, we've got a lot of regulations that already apply to AI. Let's just support the regulators issue by issue. If there is a gap in the regulation caused by the speed of AI, then we'll regulate. So as the Prime Minister has said, issue by issue. Having the Office of AI in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet takes it away from Department of Industry supporting the take-up of AI across all of industry and Department of Finance supporting the take-up of AI in government, and brings it all together along with some rules and governance around data centres. And I think probably globally we're the first to link the two. You can't get AI without data centres, and you can't actually get take-up of AI without social license. And there is an emerging issue with data centres around that social license. Within our own membership, it's quite complex. We've got members with great business opportunities, making money out of the construction of AI. We've also got potentially members competing with data centres for electricity, for water, and for land use. So bringing it all into one, I think, is really important, and it provides think about railways. Do we want different gauges in every state? No, we want a whole coordinated approach. So it's really important. The other important thing that the Prime Minister announced, and again it links to social licence, was copyright. Now, copyright's an area of AI that I've purposely avoided because it is really complex, and I've assumed that case law will eventually get us there. The example, actually, I think, Jeff, you helped me get to this example when we were talking about it in early days, is the copyright of a photo. It's not the camera manufacturer. It's not the person who paid for the photo or commissioned the photo. It's not the person who styled the photo. It's not even the subject in the photo who owns the copyright of the photo. It's whatever entity clicks the button. And I say entity because now famous case law, a monkey owns copyright of a photo that he took of himself in the jungle. Monkeys and AI, where would we start? But we have to think, collectively, who clicks a button on AI, and it's really challenging at the moment. So I think it's really important that the government, as part of that social licence, getting the Australian community on board, put very strong markers out into the marketplace about wanting to protect Australian copyright.
Mm. Now, Louise, as I mentioned, one of the things in some of the public response and commentary to the PM's announcement was that little bit of change in language where later last year AI was an opportunity, it was linked to the productivity agenda. The language framed of we need to get this into Australia to cure some of our economic ills in the country. This has moved, I guess it's a bit of a rhetorical shift towards more centralised regulation, managing harms, dealing with those meaty issues of copyright and who owns, can AI scrape things. To what extent, in your view, and I'm thinking from a kind of business and, those of us who are using AI and want to use it more and better, what does that kind of change in language mean for how industry should go about? What should we be expecting to see in the future regulatory wave?
Well, I think, as I said, it links back to that social license. And without the social license, we're not going to be able to get those productivity gains because companies aren't going to use it. More importantly, their workers won't use it. They'll resist. I think that I like the way the Prime Minister explicitly linked this to growing the economy and lifting living standards. He wasn't saying, let's not use AI, let's put the brakes on. It was just slow it down, make sure people travel with us. I guess the pitch to investors, particularly on data centres, is that a single national framework means clearer rules, faster approvals and a simpler compliance pathway, which is really what large capital, every country, around the world is fighting for this data centre investment. And I think, Jeff, you've done some analysis that if it wasn't for data centres, we'd have very little capital investment in this country. But without those data centres, we're not going to get the automation and the productivity that we want. But as I said earlier, there's that community anxiety, industry anxiety around data centres using up all the power and water, our energy companies having to gold plate the system to support the data centres, and then we as consumers all end up paying for that, whether or not the data centres are here in 10 years or not. And again, similar to my analogy on the trains, he used these historical parallels, regulating civil aviation in the 20s, coordinating gene technology in the 90s. I was at an industry session this morning about AI. There is this dichotomy of opportunities, enthusiasm, optimism with the anxiety. And so we've got to make sure we bring people along with us.
Louise, we'll talk about China and AI in a second, but now you bring up data centres and this international competition. Like, where, I guess, does Australia sit in terms of AI regulation now? Because we've got lots of different paces around the world. EU went first, probably went hardest. The US has been very laissez-faire. Where does this put us in the pack in the race for? I guess the first one is this big data centre question that's really animating the community now. But then the AI that these data centres are going to unlock at that wave of AI take up once you've got that compute locally. Where do we? Has this moved us on the international spectrum?
Well, Jeff, you and I always go on about single economic market for Australia, but I'm a globalist trade person. So ideally, I want a single regulatory market globally, which I don't think I'll ever get.
There are places outside Australia. It's hard to believe.
I think it's unique in Australia that we've linked the regulation around data centres and AI because, they're linked. As you say, Europe went first. They don't have the same Brussels effect as they do on cybersecurity. Japan also went pretty early, and they were very ambitious on their copyright. And in fact, they were quite permissive on their copyright rules to try to encourage faster take-up of AI. And I think that's the challenge. Countries, as they grapple with this, don't want to be left behind. But then how do you protect some of those legacy industries, some of our artists, some of our content creators? So I think this is a gripe of mine. He kept talking about standards. It's not the word standards as we mean for a national standard where you have, people around a table, you've got regulators, you've got industry, you've got consumers, all as on a consensus basis bringing together a standard. These are essentially regulations. But these regulations should be national. We've got states competing with each other for data centre investment. So we need a whole of government, whole of country approach to this. And what also it means by putting this body into the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, it will give us a whole of government AI safety regulation, looking at, we've already got the AI Safety Institute. So now we'll get, if we get the standards and the rules first, members have told us without the rules, they're hesitant to invest. We'll get the investment and capability followed behind. And then hopefully workers and consumers can feel confidence in the way forward.
Talking about that international element, Louise, probably the other big international AI announcement over the last couple of weeks was from China. And here's what we see just a couple of days after our Prime Minister gave his speech. Xi Jinping delivered the keynote at the World AI Conference. It was entitled, Joining Hands to Build a Just and Equitable System for Global AI Governance. China's really interesting in this place, in the AI space, because it's not necessarily considered to be the absolute leading edge of the frontier models, as the language says, but some of its use and deployment of that, particularly at scale and at a lower unit cost, has been quite profound. So it's a scale follower. And obviously, Australia's almost everybody's largest number one trading partner. This is a big change because I guess we haven't seen big top-level head of government statements out of China for this. So it's there making a mark on the field. What was in that? And I guess bring that back to us, that we've had these big new changes just coming all at the same time.
Well, I wanted to highlight Xi's speech because while, understandably there was a lot of attention on Albanese's speech and surprisingly a lot less on Xi, I think Xi's speech and China's direction on this is going to have far greater impact on industry than, well, I don't know, it's a big call, but we should balance the understanding of both and appreciate the risk of both. So China is producing AI at scale, and it seems to be faster and cheaper than the American models. There is now this competitive geopolitical competition playing out between the US and China on this hard tech. And I think it's really interesting the way he's trying to position China as a leader. So I haven't been to China since before COVID, but as I understand, AI sort of runs everything. There was an interesting article the other day saying how safe it was because, of course, it's safe. Everyone's under observation. You can't pay with cash. Everything's paid with your phone, so it can be tracked. It's a government's dream if you're a communist government on how you can monitor and supervise your people. So she framed AI as a technological revolution, similarly on the scale of steam engine, which everyone says, electricity, internet. And so he really had 4 key observations. Openness and win-win cooperation to drive innovation. A lot of the Chinese AI and robots coming out are open source, which speaks to that. Strengthening risk awareness so AI stays secure and controllable. Adaptive ethical governance to manage the technology's risks. So I wonder what we could see the risks, they seem to see as the benefits. Anyway, risks in the eye of the beholder. And I think the one that probably matters the most from us from a geopolitical point of view, he talked about sharing AI's benefits broadly so the divide between AI-rich and AI-poor countries doesn't widen. And that came with some concrete capability building offers to develop economies. I think there was something like 5,000 free AI training platforms. And it really speaks to the post, the COVID vaccination story. There was a narrative in the global south that the wealthy West quickly developed vaccines and kept them for ourselves. China also developed their own vaccine and shared it. And I was in many multilateral online meetings during that time where I had to sit through country after country thanking China for their vaccines. Were they good vaccines? Who knows? But I think this speaks to China's ambition in using this as a platform to expand their influence.
Well, Louise, just on vaccines, I remember standing in the rain for 3 hours at the Perth showgrounds to get I can't remember if it was Pfizer or Moderna, one of the Western ones. And I might have welcomed a Chinese vaccine and stayed dry. But it was September and freezing as well. But this is an interesting question. And to bring this back to industry, a lot of observers, and I don't think this would be unfair, would say, looking at, say, the US as an AI leader, and that there's this big focus on making a better AI mousetrap. This new one can do this. We'll talk about cyber in a moment, but, particularly some of the cyber risks that come out of their capabilities. Whereas China has this, I wouldn't want to be derisive and say it's a mass market offering, but it's something that you can get into a factory or a transport system or a fairly routine customer service portal straight away. Is this two AI universes that we're kind of getting that are being offered by, these leading companies and from the world leaders now on both sides?
Well, it will be interesting to see whether you can integrate the two. I mean, the Chinese AI, as I said, is open source. It doesn't come with its own platform, so you've got to put it onto your own platform. What does that mean? How do you protect your own data? And then how reliable is that data and then, the technology going forward? The fact is, though, it is very cheap and it's very tempting. If you want a humanoid robot to come through and carry heavy things, it's going to be much cheaper to get one from China than one from America.
Mm. And I think that cuts to this question of industry uptake in Australia, particularly. I'm sure people have seen the reporting that some companies that used it, their AI bills have gone up rapidly as cost recovery is coming in. There's different options here.
Yeah.
Before we go on to the next section, something completely different. There is that joke that a good dinner party, you shouldn't talk about politics or religion. We already talk about politics on DBrief a bit, so let's talk about religion too. We've also, amongst we've had Albanese, we have the Pope, Leo XIV, who issued his first papal encyclical of his papal term. It's entitled Magnificat Humanitas, which translates as kind of the excellence of humanity into English. And it was all about AI. It was about 40,000 words long, always. But it did really start asking some of these questions that we're getting to with both Albanese and Xi about, okay, well, this thing's coming. How are we going to integrate this into human systems? And it's a really interesting intervention from a religious leader on this. I have read a bit of it. I know you have as well, Louise. What is it? So the Pope's come in. Where does this leave the international debate?
Well, I think, I raise it just because I think it's an interesting point. One is that, as we've said before, AI is not really a technology problem. It's a people problem, and it doesn't get much more people than the Pope and religion. What also I find very interesting is that I keep hearing this encyclical being quoted in all sorts of different forums by particularly with sort of left-leaning people. And so that really, from an industry point of view, we have to be conscious of that because that is going to be driving a lot of conversation. It's always important to understand where people are coming from. And it is a philosophical problem. So AI decisions increasingly makes or shapes, or go directly to human dignity. So who gets to have a job? Who gets access to healthcare or credit? Increasingly, if we look at Ukraine, how wars are even fought. So it's not so much an anti-technology document, but it's just identifying the fact that we are approaching a huge social upheaval on par with the Industrial Revolution. How do we make sure, again, how do we keep people along with us? And AI uses the centuries of racism and prejudice and discrimination that we feed into it. But how can we imagine using AI for a fairer, more equitable society?
Is this something, and Wolfinji, is this something that might start affecting policymakers? There's over a billion Catholics around the world, though they're not bound. The Pope doesn't bind Catholics' behaviour. But it's very interesting to see this in an intervention, I think, at a time when a lot of people, communities around the world are trying to deal with does this mean there's some good stuff, there's some bad stuff out of AI, how do we strike this balance right? I wonder, does it move it from a practical conversation, which is when we will deal with regulators, we try and really talk about it practical. It elevates it to a philosophical, religious, ideological level. Is that where we can see the AI debate going in all three of these examples we've just talked about? It's moving from the practical bit to the philosophical bit.
I think it does. I mean, when you talk to people about AI, eventually, and the session I went to this morning, a whole bunch of constructors, the last question was, is this a society we want? And I think that's what everyone's grappling with. And I talked about, social license. There is a huge amount of change. And as I said, using a lot of data from history to entrench potentially discrimination. We're going to be talking about modern slavery. There's lots of instances where there's a whole bunch of people using AI in scam camps. There's people using AI, to monitor and housekeep data. There will be winners and losers, as there always are in technology. I think we've had all those experiences, and now, religious leaders, political leaders, we as industry leaders, civil society leaders, we're all now grappling with, well, let's not make the same mistakes of last time. Let's make sure we bring as many people along with us and everyone gets to benefit, which is very kumbaya. But anyway, we can hope, and it certainly can inform the conversation.
Thanks, Louise. We'll just take a quick break and we'll be back to talk about some AI and cybersecurity issues after the break.
You're listening to the DBrief podcast, brought to you by Australian Industry Group. To find out more about how Australian Industry Group can help your business, visit australianindustry.com.au.
Welcome back to DBrief, where I'm talking to Louise McGrath around issues around AI. And now we'll be moving on in the second half of this episode into questions around how that's actually affecting some other things going on for industry as well. Probably the most immediate one I'd start with is cybersecurity. I think we all know AI has got a big linkage there in terms of its ability to both improve cyber offense and defense. But this is a landscape that's already fundamentally changed and is quickly changing. There was recently a joint statement by the Five Eyes cybersecurity agencies. So this is United States, Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, regarding AI and cybersecurity and some principles and guidelines for how governments think we need to deal with this new edge of the threat. Louise, could you tell us about it?
Well, this really caught my attention, Jeff, because I'm, as I said in the blog that I released around this time, I'm a complete, spy story junkie. So when the spies come out into the light and talk, I really feel like we should pay attention. But I thought what was interesting, we often think of, spies of, people in trench coats and car parks, etc. But, the big battle at the moment for all our security agencies is online, and that's our cybersecurity agency. So in Australia, it's the Australian Signals Directorate. And so they released this advice, the AI shift in cyber risk, why leaders must act now. And the core message was that frontier AI models are expected to exceed our current industry expectations and fundamentally transform both the offensive and the defensive cyber capability. So in their words, the timeline is not years, it's months. And how prescient was it? Because within a month, we heard that one of Anthropic's tools, Opus, I think it was, broke out of its sandbox and broke into another system to work out how it worked, and then came back. So essentially a cyber attack, whether it was malicious or not. So it really, it was a very, very timely warning for everyone.
This is a really scary one for organisations, I think, because our CEO Ernest Willits loves to say that cyber's the thing that keeps him up at night. And he used to say that before AI was part of the picture. We've probably been talking to industry leaders about cyber for years now, and it's boiled the frog because things have changed slightly. But there is this big tectonic shift. I think something else people would worry about, some of these models have not been released, right? Like some of the Anthropic models, they're saying, well, we're not actually going to publish this one yet because we think it's too dangerous. And yet here it is sneaking out some back door, which I think confuses everyone. What does this mean for industry leaders who've invested in cyber? They've been doing the uplift. The game's changed for the worse again. And now we have these. How do you manage a cyber risk that's not even released? Like your IT team can't go and have a look at Mythos. They won't, it's not out, right? Like how do we grapple with an unknown cyber risk in comparison to what we've dealt with 0 days and other stuff in the past?
Yeah. Well, I think, how do you manage it? So there is also, as I said, it's also transforming the offensive. So let's talk positive first. And, with CSIRO have got some products that have come out that have done a lot of research to create what's called honeypots, where you effectively create a digital twin of all your data and somehow put bells and whistles to attract the cyber attackers onto that and somehow protect your own thing. I would like to think cyber is smarter, but anyway, apparently it does work. I think, though, while we're talking about the AI tools and it does accelerate things and it accelerate risks, always come back to the people. And, when you think about AI, cyber training, it has to be around the people. So as we've talked about previously, the real challenge with AI as a technology revolution is that so much is coming bottom up. In the old days, no one would have come to work with their own fax machine or their own PC. Companies had to invest in these and issue them. Now you come in with a phone filled with all sorts of different AI that you may or may not understand. You could be putting your own company data in there, could be somehow connecting it to the network. That's the real risk. So companies need to really invest in that training and all the sorts of barriers that make life difficult when you're working in a company with multi-factor authentication, constant password updates, all those sorts of things, as painful they are the sort of things that they have to do. There is also a lot of guidance from ASD. So the Signals Directorate, they've had their Essential 8. I think they're expanding that now to try to capture all these growing risks and to really support businesses as they address this challenge.
Well, moving on from the AI stuff to something that we frequently, this is an evergreen topic on DBrief, unfortunately, Donald Trump and American tariffs. I'd like to if one day we could get a string of 5 where we can avoid this one. But unfortunately, we can't. Now, just a couple of weeks ago as well, the Trump administration finalised an additional set of new tariffs on 60 countries around the world. Australia was one of those. And unlike previous rounds of tariffs that have been tied to manufacturing or reciprocal tariff rates, this one was a bit novel because they were at least ostensibly tied to issues around forced labour and enforcement of labour rules. This gets very complicated, Louise, but you have been very deeply engaged in issues around labour standards and modern slavery regulations in Australia for many years. Can you explain to us what are these new tariffs?
Yeah, so we've been working closely with the Australian Embassy in Washington and with colleagues across, other industry groups. So let's not be confused and think, does Donald Trump and the US Trade Representative suddenly care about forced labour? It is captured in a number of their free trade agreements, and it has been at the US border primarily to block out Chinese product from produced with Uyghur labour. So the US have a customs system where you have to prove that your product, it's often solar panels, were not made using forced labour. And once you've proven that, then you can enter it. So it's guilty before proof. When they scanned the world to look at what forced labour and modern slavery regimes every country had, that's what they were focused on. And why did they do that? Because they lost the argument on their Freedom Day global tariffs. So this was another way to deal with that. I would say they found, the new rates were tiered. So around 17 economies face 10% because they've adopted at least partial import bans and very much focused on import bans. 38, including Australia, face 12.5% on the basis that we've failed to effectively enforce one. I would say Australia's never going to have an import ban. What we do have, though, is quite a substantial Modern Slavery Act. However, it is under review and it is about to be strengthened further.
We'll talk about Australia's settings in a second, Louise, but just before we get to home on this, what's this going to mean in terms of the issues regarding US tariffs and protectionism for global supply chains? We've been dealing with this since Liberation Day, about 16 months ago now, right? We've had some things come off and now this is back on. Where would we expect to see this in terms of some of the other tariffs that we've had up and down from the US administration, irrespective of what the purported cause for them is?
So these tariffs touch roughly 99.4% of US imports. So it's not a targeted measure. It's pretty universal. It will raise import costs across the board and a real compliance documentation burden across all supply chains in terms of getting proof, and accelerate the broader push towards diversifying sourcing away from any single market. that's exposed to these US policy shifts. I mean, the US is primarily focused on imports from China, and our imports from China, so that is a problem. I mean, I'll harp on again about single economic market, but the unilateral way that countries are dealing with modern slavery, everyone is trying to deal with it in their own way. It is proving very, very challenging for Australian companies. Even New Zealand, I know I'm always beating up on New Zealand. New Zealand is introducing its own Modern Slavery Act. I think it's very close to getting through Parliament at the moment. It's pushed harder than Australia. That's fine. It can do that. But why on earth would it choose a different timing for reporting? All large companies in New Zealand are Australian companies. They're not going to want to do two different reports. They're going to do one report at the same time. We need countries to work together to find a common solution to this.
Look, we've always had to struggle with that Japanese financial year that's April to April, and like not now New Zealand, not now. Bringing it back close to home, I guess for Australia, I mean, there's two parts to this. The first part would be how we've diplomatically responded. I can't imagine what it would be like being on the trade desk in DC at the moment in the embassy. But then also, like, how does this link up? Because we do have a fairly extensive modern slavery regime, as you mentioned, is changing for the stronger. Where does that leave our policy settings with this?
So the Australian Embassy lodged a formal objection, and that report's available online if people want to read it, and said there's no credible evidentiary basis for finding against us, and the fact that even the US's own trafficking in persons report has consistently given Australia its best possible rating. So the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, said it was unjustified, inconsistent with our free trade agreement, all the usual stuff that we talk about. I think the response, though, and even though the government will tell us it's not the response, I think the response is actually a greater form of self-harm, because while during the discussions around the reform and the review of the current Modern Slavery Act, there was a lot of talk around having more due diligence, so forcing companies, rather than just have a report of actions they're doing, more meaningful action, trying to understand what they are doing to truly identify slavery or modern slavery in their supply chains. What was announced was criminal penalties. So we're going from a scenario where at the moment, if you don't submit your report, there's no consequences. It's not even a fine. You might get named and shamed if they know that you haven't put it in, to now criminal penalties. And talking to companies, there's really strong concern that, this is an overkill, that those companies who have well-established human rights teams, invest heavily in this area, who have reported instances of modern slavery they've identified in their supply chains, have said to me, we'll wait for the real detail. But what's been announced so far, there's no incentive for them to even highlight what they found because of the risk their directors and managers receiving these criminal penalties. So I think it's not an import ban, so it's not going to actually meet the US threshold. So that's one thing. And two, the self-harm it will cause to our own industry and supply chains, I think, is far too significant. So this is something we'll be working on. And in a couple of weeks, we'll have a deep dive in the Modern Slavery Act in Australia.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Louise. That's our time done for the day. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. If you found this podcast via a link or on our website, please be reminded you can subscribe to it on whichever podcast platform you're currently using. If you did have any input, comments or questions you'd like to ask or share with us, you can find us on LinkedIn, but we also have an email address, which is industry.policy@australianindustrygroup.com.au. My name's Jeff Wilson. I've been speaking with Louise McGrath. Thank you very much.